subatomic to the heavens. And today we're going to sort of cone in on the fact that the Lord had made all this creation for us special. And so we're going to cover the human body, and then we're going to conclude. This is really one of these two sections, one session talks. We're going to focus in on the eye in particular, and I'm kind of biased about the eye, as you know, so I'm going to devote a whole half of a talk to that. So the theme for tonight is going to be design, okay? So remember that little small stuff we talked about, the first couple of things, atoms, molecules, organic molecules, cells. Well, that occupied the first 3 days or so. And the theme there really was complexity but order. We've got some complexity and order tonight as well. Remember the big stuff from 2 weeks ago, the creation of the universe, the heavens, and that really we read scripturally is to demonstrate his glory and his righteousness. And that took, the fourth day. And then another day and a half went to, all the creeping things. We went through the journey to man and some of the features of some other of his creation, which really I'm just going to term man's dominion that God gave us, right? So in the afternoon, Saturday afternoon, after all the football games, or I guess that's in the middle of them, God made the man. So the human body really, I think it's fair enough to consider the climax of his creation, made in his image, his likeness, and it's the only day where he said things were not only just good, but very good. So he's proud of us, right? So our goal tonight will be to survey really in a very superficial way, although it may not seem that way, the breadth of what the human body entails. And again, demonstrate the theme of tonight really is the amazing design of all these processes and capabilities. And make the point tacitly or even directly that there just seems too many processes, adaptations, and capabilities to have just gotten here by trial and error, especially when you remember it's in the bigger picture of all that molecular stuff that underlies and underpins all these things. So just as a segue here, Psalm 139:14, I'm sure you're all, I will praise thee, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Marvelous are thy works, Lord, and thy soul knoweth right well. So, and again, the theme is going to be supernatural design, or otherwise known as irreducible complexity. So it's just, we're going to see just unfathomable numbers of things that are the design that we have. And from right down to the healing capabilities, the adaptations. But we want to keep in mind that most of the low animals have a lot of these same kinds of systems and adaptations as well. So it's not like he practiced, to get to us. It's just we're the pinnacle of what he made. And again, there's a multiplicity. We're going to cover the organs, a couple of the tissues, some of the systems that underline which are so many different processes, from differentiation to the formation of embryogenesis and the function and the regulation, which is key. And another basic theme here is that there's a basic building unit for most each of the organs that underlies the larger thing. So again, design but order. So for the body is one and has many members, and the members of one body being many are one body, so is Christ. So let's begin with what's not. There's a strong argument for evolution is that we have all these vestigial organs, which is to say leftover things from evolution that they were just, movies that didn't sell, But Darwin listed 12 of them in his sequel to The Origin of Species that we call The Descent of Man, published 1871, 12 years later. And other anatomists have numbered upwards of 100 different vestigial organs over that 150 or so years ago. But as it turns out, science has been able to identify a use for most of those things at this point. It's just sort of my top 10 here is the thymus. That used to get removed because they thought it was, but that's an important source of where T cells, one of the key components of our immune system is. The pineal gland is what keeps us understanding day and night and how our body's clock runs. The pituitary gland, which just is the way station for many, many endocrine functions. The ear muscle, it protects us against loud noises. Why do you need a muscle in the ear? Well, that's why you do. When it's loud, you can, it contracts and dampens so it doesn't knock those little bones out of place. The tonsils and adenoids, which used to always get removed, and now you may know we don't remove those as much anymore. Well, I never did, as I'm not, but they don't get removed. They're lymphoid tissue, important lymphoid tissue. The coccyx, which is the base of your spine, thought, oh, well, that's a leftover part of when you had tails. But so there's no use of that, right? Well, if you bang it, you sure know there's use for it, but But as it turns out, there's 6 muscles anchored, and it forms the pelvic floor. It keeps our guts from falling down, right? So molars, and the appendix is also lymphoid tissue, so although that can get infected and need to be removed. Goosebumps, people wondered, why are those little muscles around your hairs? Well, it helps to keep you warm, right, when you're cold. So, and then there's talk about the Babinski and the grasp reflex that little kids still have as being abnormal compared to adults, but that's just pre-programmed, it's not a remnant. So if we know a reason for most of them, and yet there might be a couple that we don't know, it's trending pretty good. Why don't we just presume that we have just simply not found the function for those yet, instead of still believing that those are some remnant of evolution? So let's just, again, we're going to give a little whistle-stop tour through some of the major organs here. The skin, it's not just skin deep. It's actually the largest by weight organ in our whole body. You don't really think of it like that. It's kind of next to your overcoat, right? And it's got all kinds of glands for body oils and sweat and things. It's a lot more complex than we thought. There's a Nobel Prize that was given out. I'm not supposed to say how much Nobel Prizes, but at any rate, these things called aquaporins. If you ever thought, all of a sudden you can pour out, the sweat's just pouring off of you sometimes if it's hot out there. Well, how could that happen? It's because there's actually openings in the cells that let water come through freely instead of having to sort of diffuse through and bead up and be excreted through a formal gland. Sensory receptors, this is just a few of them. Just imagine you can feel sharp things, you can feel warm things, dense things, vibrations. There's all kinds of sensory receptors that we have in our skin. And it's very adaptable. It gets thicker. We've talked this before. That you work with your hands, you're going to get some calluses on them, so you'll be protected. Your soles of your feet are thicker skin than other parts of your body. Melanin production can be increased here, especially in South Florida or your local tanning salon. And everybody's got a unique fingerprint. Even twins have different fingerprints. So every person is known, uniquely. The gastrointestinal or digestive system. Some parts of this, most of this stuff we just take for granted until we have a problem with it and have to go get it fixed, right? Or try to get it fixed if it can. But the gastrointestinal begins up in your mouth. I mean, just when you're chewing, your tongue has to help fold the food, and your teeth have to be able to break it and cut at the muscles to make your teeth go the right way. Swallowing mechanism. I remember when I was in medical school, there was a swallow center where I was, and the guy who was the head of it, he was doing some great and interesting work. There's some 50 pairs of muscles that work in concert to make you be able to swallow things. If you can't swallow, it's pretty inconvenient to be able to get food otherwise, right? The esophagus. Remember, that's kind of the common pathway, and then it splits to the lungs, the trachea, and the rest of the esophagus. The upper airway goes there. Well, there's this little trap door, the esophagus, right? And it's kind of the gateway. And if we didn't have that, the water would willy-nilly go into your lungs. We'd be waterboarding ourselves every time we take a drink of water, right? And furthermore, what happens if some does go down the wrong pipe? We've had that happen. we have reflexes to cough it up. So, a lot of design in all this, If we didn't have that, I'd say we'd drown, The stomach, it's flexible volume. The pH is 2, which is pretty acidic. If you've ever had to wash your pool while down with like muriatic acid, that's about a pH of 2. That's the kind of acid we have in our stomach. So why doesn't that eat through our tissues? If we get it in our skin, it wrecks our skin up, but not in our stomach, because we have special special cells, goblet cells, that make resistant coating on our stomach, so we don't get hurt by that. And all kinds of regulation for how much or how little acid we need to have. The gallbladder adds necessary ingredients to help us digest all those tasty fatty foods. And pancreas, and not only does it control sugar, but it injects a bunch of digestive juices that also neutralizes some of that acid before the food goes into our intestines. Right? The small intestine, it brings water in so it can solubilize your food and extract and reabsorb all the important stuff. And the reason it can do it so effectively is it's got these little microvilli, something like those gecko handles. Remember I showed you pictures of the geckos. There's these microvilli which greatly increases the surface area on the internal lining of your stomach to the point of 2,700 square feet. That's about an average 3 or 4 bedroom house. So there's a lot of space that's fit into that and folded in. It's actually about 20 feet long, the small intestine is. There's a network of blood vessels. There's great selectivity, and just imagine all the different, biochemically controlled and regulated things. The colon basically reabsorbs water, and the rectum is important. We all know if we don't have that, there's other problems. And the mucosal lining of the gut. It's said that there's 75% of the body's immune cells are in the gut. So there's a very good first protector, as it were, ID checker for good and bad bugs coming into you. So each one of these, just for this one digestive system, has to work together. It's complex, it's orderly functioning, and it's underlined by all kinds of sort of hidden under the radar biochemical processes. The liver, the largest solid body organ in the body, and it can regenerate. It's actually I think it's the only organ that can do that. And it's said that 60% of all the protein coding genes are expressed in the liver. So it's really an active powerhouse. It's got its own little building block, the hepatic lobule. The veins bring in the stuff from the stomach, the intestinal system, and it gets absorbed and processed, and eventually gets into the central vein where whatever's left over gets reoxygenated and eliminated. There's some 500 different functions that have been identified as taking place in the liver. 500, each of which has all kinds of, again, complex multi-part proteins in it to detoxify, remove dead red blood cells. Clotting factors are made there, storage of vitamins and glucose as glycogen. A lot of amino acids are stored there. And just consider the efficiency of so many functions in that one organ taking place, having to be right. If they're not right, then there's sickness, disease, and many times death. The kidneys, some 1 million of these nephrons, the basic building block for the nephron. It controls body fluids, hydration, acid-base balance. If that gets off, then there's a fairly narrow margin through which we can actually be viable. It controls the osmolality. It's why if you have too much coffee, too much salt, you'll know it, your kidney's working. If there's not enough water, the kidney knows how to reabsorb and keep the water in. And all kinds of other electrolyte balances, reabsorption and secretion of different things that are vital to our normal everyday functionings. Controls a lot of metabolic things, including erythropoietin. This is of EPO fame. That's what Lance, that bicyclist, Armstrong, was caught doing, right? Just again, imagine, here's every single one of these organs has many, many different functions with specialized cells, incredible organization, complexity. And if we didn't have it working optimally, many of them, we'd die, right? Liver failure, you die. Kidney failure, well, we can go on dialysis for a while, but if you didn't have that, you'd die. The circulatory system, well, prior to the kind of Renaissance time, it was thought that the heart was somehow involved in pumping blood through your body, but they thought it went through these little pores out of your intestines. And you may know that it was verboten to do dissection. And the big sort of Renaissance time advantage was that William Harvey, they did dissection and they could actually see things working. And an age of reason is what it's called. There's a little bit of literature history for you. But it was, the church prevented anybody from doing that. It was verboten to do that. And the heart, with its coronary arteries, it pumps, about a gallon and 5 liters a minute. And in fact, that's the whole volume. So it turns over our volume every minute in pumping at about 70 beats a minute. But it itself has amazing things. It's got this ticker, the sinoatrial node, that's what makes the heart beat. We don't control it. We can't change it in any way. It's there. It's set, programmed to go that way. Every single chamber, there's separations from one chamber to the other. It's got its own custom doors, its own valve in between each one that's designed. None of them are the same. It's not like it's cookie cutter for every valve. It's wrapped in a pericardium, a wrapping that protects it from other organisms, another barrier from infections and such. And there can be a fluid that accumulates between that pericardium and the heart if there's high stress and pulmonary edema. And that's perhaps when Jesus was pierced, that's perhaps how there was blood and water that came out, because that would not be clotted if it was in that space. And there's a little bit of neural output, which is why our heart can pump faster when we're afraid or anxious about things. And it's just a big muscle with a lot of things, including the coronary arteries, which when they get blocked, that's when you have the coronary artery bypass, i.e. a heart attack. The vessels, they come in various oxygenated going away, venous coming towards you, the capillaries, the lymphatics. The blood pressure control, there's specialized little receptors, stretch receptors in the aorta, the upper part of the aortas, that control the blood pressure to keep it right. Because what would happen? We have to have regulation. We take it for granted, right? If the blood pressure is too high, we stroke out, we bleed. If it's too low, we pass out because we don't get perfusion. And blood has a lot of different special components that we're only going to barely touch on here. And actually, as it turns out, they've recently discovered that the blood vessels actually have a little bit of a helical design to them in a superstructure, which is what gives them better flow pattern than just going through a rigid pipe, or not even rigid, just a straight homogeneous pipe. So again, it screams out to me design. The lungs, there's mechanical aspects of it. There's muscles, lots of different muscles that have to go into moving your lungs. Contrast it to the riveting frog. It kind of belches, it swallows its air and puts it down and then belches it back out. The bird, remember I told you, it's kind of a flow-through system because they don't breathe in and breathe out. And then there's no in-between. I mean, imagine how could you have a transition from some of these things to another. The alveoli is the unit system here. That's where there's air that goes into these little sacs that interchanges with a rich network of blood vessels so that the carbon dioxide can be extracted, the oxygen can be put back in. And just like in the small intestine, because there's all these little small, tiny little things, there's an increased surface area, some 1,400 square foot. So this is only like a 2-bedroom house worth of space available for exchange. The control of the ventilation, I just put these up to say it's really complex. It goes through the brain. There's parts in the brain that we're not even going to talk about that have relevance to controlling that. And if any one of those things wasn't working, we wouldn't breathe and we wouldn't be here, right? Oxygen goes in, out with the bad, in with the good, out with the bad, the CO2. If we had to rely only on oxygen's solubility, we didn't have hemoglobin, then we'd actually have to beat our heart 1,000 times a minute in order to get enough oxygen delivered to our lungs to run the business of moving around. But the hemoglobin is specially designed to carry oxygen and CO2 actually in a facultative way, a very adjusted way. So blood flow is, of course, linked to the heart. There's some 25 billion red cells that get pumped every minute, but the red cells only spend less than a second in the alveoli, so about a gallon per minute, I told you. Again, such a vital function, there's really no room for it working partway or for there to be any errors in development, because if there was a new mutation that was supposedly a trial, the species would go and there wouldn't be any more. Nose, again, we just take some of these things for granted. Some 20,000 liters of air go through our nose every day. It's a big business for nose jobs, 225,000 rhinoplasties every year in the US. I didn't know this till recently, that only one nostril is usually open at a time when you breathe. Somehow, don't ask me why, but there's actually a form of yoga that tries to control that. So that's one of those, who knows, we'll figure it out someday, I guess. But olfactory cells is how we smell odors, and supposedly we can smell up to 1 trillion different distinct odors. I don't know that there are that many, but we supposedly have that ability. We got little hairs in our nose, right? They trap debris and junk. You know, you've seen that. When you blow out, you've been working in a dusty environment. And think as well, between the nose and the sinuses that the air goes through, it warms and humidifies the air before it gets into the lungs, or else it would just be too cold for our lungs. It also has we know this when we get a cold, don't we? It has a big impact on what the sound of our voice is, the intonation. That's why we can talk like Caruso sometimes, or if we have a cold, right? The brain, I mean, we could talk for an hour on the brain. This is a totally unbelievable thing that we only have a cursory understanding of, right? Superficial. It's about, what's that, about 1.5 pounds. Power of 1,000 supercomputers, computing power. 200 billion neurons that have about 100 trillion connections. And if we took all of our neurons and laid them all out, it's been estimated that would be about 100,000 miles long. And all the signals that go along this pathway are about 10 to the 15th. That would be, a million billion. So it's 1,000 trillion per second. And about 25% of our entire energy is supposedly spent on the brain, which is only 2% of our entire mass. It's organized in many different strata and ways and directions really, very well. The cerebral cortex, which you're seeing here in this sort of gray color, it's got 2 different lobes, of course, the right and the left lobe. And Each lobe, and it's also got multiple lobes that we'll talk about in a moment. The white matter is the deeper cells. It's got a lot more fat in it. It's where, it's mostly nerves, whereas the outer part has these sensory and motor nerves, the gray matter. And each of these lobes we'll talk about a little bit before. There's like parietal lobe, and that there's specific centers of activity in each of these lobes. So it's a very organized organ. The cerebellum is this little guy in the back. And it's folded more than was realized until relatively recently. It's very tightly packed. And the reason I dwell on that is that it's got more folds than our supposedly immediate predecessors, the other apes, but it's got fewer than some of these lower animals and fishes. So it doesn't make sense why we'd go in one direction and then the other direction as we're going up this order of complexity. In general, the cerebellum controls motor and learning and coordination and motor and posture, but it also evidently helps with certain cognitive functions involving mathematics and such. And there's all kinds of specialized centers and organs within the brain that we just don't have time to talk about for doing a lot of regulatory things. I mentioned this before. The thing that's amazing, like anything to me, is that there's some, in the womb, there's some 25,000 neurons formed per minute when the baby's growing. And then about 50% of those will die within just a few months after death. Of those neurons will die. Now, if you're really good with trees, you probably know which branches to cut off to make the tree grow better. But if you're not really good and you make a mistake, you could kill that tree. I mean, how does the system know which neurons to weed out and which neurons to keep? It's something called apoptosis, and it's an area of great and active investigation. There's blood supply to the brain. That's where people get strokes if they get too much blood, too little blood. So, and again, like everything else, it all has to work together. We haven't even talked about higher order thinking. What goes on when you're making a decision, all the different integration of different functions. It just will blow your mind. For example, if you have no brainstem, you have no breathing. The ears, external. There's more than just the earlobe, right? And there's also, you'll see the biggest thing, of course, we know the ears for is for the sound. There's the cochlea, which is tuned from a broad range, 20 to 20,000 hertz, with all these different nerve endings that, depending upon what the resonant frequency is of a sound coming in, but it's more than just hearing. The ear, as perhaps you know, controls stationary balance through the utricle and saccule. It controls through the semilunar canal the sensation of body position, acceleration. It's how you know you're going up or down, an elevator, and dynamic balance. It's how the football players can catch these circus catches in the end zones, and again, just imagine the neural interface just of the ears with the brain, because you hear something, you make an association. Oh, that's a dog barking, or oh, something's coming close to me, I better put my hand up to protect myself, Just all kinds of perceptions at a very higher level of brain functioning. The tongue, there's 5 sensors. It was a little bit later in history that they learned about this umami, which is for sensing supposedly meaty or savory deep flavors. But, there's specialized cells for sensing taste, and then that gets connected neurologically to processing centrally. Each person, did you know this, has their own tongue print. The FBI, I don't think, is keeping tongue prints, but their fingerprints is enough. The tongue is necessary for speech. I think one of the mafia things used to be that if you ratted, they'd cut your tongue off, or some societies have had that. So you can't talk, you get your tongue cut out, you can't talk. And you'd say, well, how come man has lost some of the taste functions compared to some of these other animals? Evolutionists would say, well, it's because they didn't really need to go rooting around looking for things as much as the lower animals might. The skeletal system, 206 bones. You're born with more, not really more, you're born with bones that haven't yet fused together. But there's a good way for how a body will grow. There's these growth plates. So you start with a tiny little bone, and it's because it's a couple of them, and there's these growth plates. You can fuse them together, and it grows in just the right time, just the right fashion, unless there's some disease, right? What the bone's made of is this collagen, which is kind of like the rebar, and apatite, which is like the cement that fills to makes it. And there's this spongy internal amount that gives better reinforcement. And I think I mentioned how the structure of the bone has been mimicked in some building materials as well. And then the marrow is in the inside. That's where the blood cells are made. The unit is the osteon, where there's blood vessels growing through the middle, what's called Haversian canal. And this is one of the only organs that can can regenerate and remodel. I mentioned the liver can, but this is how you can have a broken bone that will heal with time if you splint it. And that fact is routinely used by thoracic and reconstructive surgeons. They'll take bones from one area and try to rebuild another bone that may have been shattered and lost its integrity. And that might be, I don't know, we don't want to be too presumptuous, but maybe that's how God took Adam's rib and he was able to make another. I mean, he could do it like that, but it's a cute little story, but So Adam's rib might be from being borrowed. And again, we're not going to go through them, but there's many examples of excellent design. I mentioned the growth plates. All of our different joints have very special ways that they're developed, and the prosthetic joints that are made, they're still only a weak second place to the joints, the well-functioning joints that we have, but they may be the lesser of the two evils if we've done something to the other joint. But so we wonder, why don't we find some parts of the body ahead of or behind other parts of just even the skeletal system? And we don't. Everything, again, seems to be at the same level of development and working together equally. The hand, I often thought that if I hadn't gone into ophthalmology, hand surgery might have been a really interesting thing to go into. You've had an incredible range. You can grip some people up to like 100-pound power of grip, but if you can control as little as less than 1/10 of an ounce by how fine. So what a range of how well your hand can work that way. Not to mention that the reason it can is it's disproportionate. I think I might have mentioned this in the first introductory lecture. This is something called the homunculus. And this red part is the motor cortex. And this is now taking 90 degrees from what you're looking at here. So it's a vertical, we call that frontal slice of the brain. And this is a picture drawn to show that what proportion of the neurons, the motor neurons, are devoted to what parts of the body. And the hand and the mouth are the two biggest things. For some of us, this might be bigger than others, but the speed range you can do as little in anticipated as 40 millisecond movements. That's how people can play those 30-second notes. The pianists can play that. And think of all the different coordination in so many things we do, whether it's piano or anything. What makes humans also unique is what's called the opposable thumb. Apes can't put their first and fifth digit together like that. They can only grab this way. So that's why we can do some of the things that the apes can't do. And think of the hand as well. There's 27 bones wrapped together and connected to muscles and things with ligaments and the tendons with the muscles, and the bone to bone is ligaments. And that all works together to have the right shape and the right function. Not to mention the integration with the visual system, the auditory system, all through the brain to make it all work right. So my hand waving. An interesting study here is looking at God's hand in Scripture. Sometimes 122 verses supposedly speak of the hand, usually God's hand, and that's just an interesting little side study you can do sometime. So just the organs, I've emphasized the complexity yet order, how every function is a necessary function. If it wasn't right from the start, we'd be dead. Note how there's no changes either that have been observed. I mean, in sort of known history, we've got at least a few hundred years. You'd think that we'd recognize at least some minor change that has been improved upon if it was evolution, but we haven't. But there's more than just the organs. We can drill down more. Every organ has specialized or differentiated tissue, and every piece of tissue must be specially expressed. And it's been directed to be, every cell, and in its properly differentiated form, has been directed to the right place for the right time during embryonic development, and it's connected to the right complement for it. Remember, we mentioned before, every single cell in your body has exactly the same DNA, right? Whether it's a blood cell, not a red cell, they don't have nuclei, but white cell, or whether it's a muscle cell, or whether it's one of those little smelling cells, they all have the exact same DNA, and the reason one is different from the other is because of all the regulatory intercodons, the non-protein coding part of the thing. We talked about that. So again, I just think irreducible complexity is, how could it be anything but design? So there's generally considered 4 main tissue types, and this is a very broad swath, but we're just going to cover a couple of them just to give a sense for what we're talking about here. That's that same DNA point. So nervous tissue. Generally speaking, central nervous system can't regenerate, but maybe it can. They've been finding that maybe there's ways to influence that process. Maybe the axons can, but the neurons themselves have a harder time. The axon is the the wire that comes out of the nucleus, the head thing. Peripheral nerves generally can regenerate, so that's why if you cut something, they can grow back. Neurons have a cell body with a variably length axon. Some of those axons can be several feet long even. It can be sensory or motor or otherwise. There's about 10 to the 11th of these neurons in our body. That number may not mean it's 100 billion. That's about how many stars there are in the solar system, our solar system, Milky Way. And it's not really electricity, but what happens is it changes the potential, the polarization of the membrane of the axon in a wave-like, electric-like way is how energy or a signal gets sent. But there's a junction box where the one junctions another. There's what's called a synapse, and the synapse is mediated by a whole host of different neurotransmitters. There's some that are major more than others, but there's a lot of different neurotransmitters that have to jump that gap and turn on a receptor on the other side to carry out and continue that. And every axon or cell neuron might synapse with as much as 10,000 other neurons. So just imagine the wiring diagram for that one. And I haven't even begun to talk about the supporting cells, the glial cells, the ones that bring metabolic, the supply lines, the astrocytes, the oligodendrocytes that produce the myelin sheath that keeps things insulated. That's what makes the insulation for these. And just notice how many cell types are interacting with each other in order for just the basic thought of the neural system to work, much less how it's connected to so many different endpoints. The muscles are 3 different types: the skeletal muscle, the smooth muscle, and the cardiac muscle. They have their own individual little things. We'll talk a little bit. An interesting thing is how muscles can adapt. I think I've mentioned that before. And I want to thank Damien for posing for this picture tonight. So the skeletal type really has 2 basic different types. There's the slow twitch and the fast twitch, and you might have heard of that. There's some people who are just drop-dead sprinters. Usain Bolt, you'd never see him in a marathon, would you? Well, he could probably beat most of us in a marathon, but there's marathon long, aerobic, and then there's a short burst, anaerobic. And again, there's differences that have been designed just for that, and there's nothing in between. It's one or the other. And it's a complex mechanism of contraction. So at a nearly molecular level, we have this actin and myosin in what's called a sarcomere, and these will associate with each other and contract based on how much calcium has been gated to be allowed in each individual cell. And then they're wrapped together in a myofibril, which gets to put together in a muscle fiber, which gets to put together in a fascicle, which is a muscle which then is connected to bones through ligament tendons to create that action. And each of these, of course, is under the influence of the nervous systems, the neurotransmitters through those nerves. And interestingly, to me at least, even little insects actually have muscle tissue. So the minorest and smallest of creation has that. Maybe not as many types, but they have the same. And again, it's just another example of how specialized and complex this system is, and there's little difference across most species. So there's really no sign of a transitional form, which again just seems to indicate design. So I've talked about organs, I've talked about tissues, and now systems, which we're only going to cover a couple of them because there's literally millions of these systems. Every amino acid gets made by one way. We went over the Krebs cycle. But even beyond that, just to get one component, one iron into a cell, or one piece of gold, you may need gold for certain things, for enzymes, there's ways of recycling and entering those. Most of them are because of their cell. There's these little centuries, there's these proteins that have specialized aspects to them that will recognize and allow certain things in and certain things out. Just all kinds of biochemical cascades. This is just an example, for example, of apoptosis, just a couple of the different steps that have been identified. There's probably even more steps than that. And as I say, there's thousands, if not millions, of these different systems. And the cells, their cells can signal directly to each other. They can either get really close and whisper in each other's ear by sending things, or they can tweet from one to the other if they're close, or they can send a snail mail through a blood vessel if they want to send something to a more distant place. So again, all these different complex ways that connect. And there's just, again, innumerable regulatory systems, just too many systems to involve with so many complex things to be step by step. Because if there's one break in that step, it's either non-functional or not very functional. Considering just one, the clotting system. Platelets, actually only mammals have platelets. Interesting, there's nothing transitional from pre-mammals to mammals. There's no nucleus in the platelets. The platelets are very important for adhesion and bringing together blood cells and starting the clot if you're bleeding. But in the clotting system, there's some 30 components. And if you don't have one of them working right, then you have people make their life study out of clotting disorders. I mean, most famously, of course, is hemophilia, right? From the kings back in the... I did have a little bit of... Okay, the English kings. Were they the French kings, or were they both of them? I don't know. There was some hemophilia. Russian one was right, Alexander. But anyway, so noting the complexities that all of these 30 things have to work together, or else they don't work at all. And if they're wrong, not only you get hemophilia, but you can go the other way and have too much, too little. Everything will clot. You'll get disseminated intravascular and shock. You die if these things don't work right, is the point. The endocrine system, and again, we don't have time to go over all this either, but if you look at just the sort of the nerve center, if you will, of the endocrine system is the hypothalamus, buried deep in the brain. And it's what regulates in a sort of more executive way all these different sub-organs that have their own little role. I'll just touch on the adrenal glands. This is the one that, guys take the steroids to pump up, their muscles and such, but with other problems that can come from that. And again, each one of these has their own detailed structure, their detailed processes, specialized cells that carry out those different things with, again, unfathomable mechanisms of control and initiation and the like. And many of these, if something's not working right, it's fatal. If your pituitary gland doesn't work right, you can be stunted growth, but some of these things you die if they're not working. So you never could have evolved, it would seem. The immune system, every cell in our body has markers that tell us a self or non-self, sort of friend or foe, as in the military things. And the first responders are the neutrophils, and they work in conjunction with blood clotting platelets sometimes. But for an infection, the neutrophils will come in, and there's specialized neutrophil-type cells that can also be useful in certain circumstances. Lymphocytes are the ones that then come in later. They're kind of the foot soldiers, the infantry, and there's many different kinds that have many different roles. And in fact, it's one of these lymphocytes, the CD4 cells, that are not viable, and that's what is the target of HIV infection, for example. Every humoral means it's in the body, it's liquid, it's not a cell, but it's produced by B cells, the antibodies themselves, which mature in the spleen. In the birds, it's the spursa fabricus, but they make these many different antibodies, and they're seemingly pre-filled because every immune cell has as many as 200,000 receptors. So collectively, there's a billion unique receptors that we're born with that are waiting to be primed to recognize something as not good, a bacteria or something. And there's just many different systems to regulate this, of some 20 different molecules, cytokines and other things that factor into how the immune system is activated and does its function. So the complement system has 3 arms. That's an important way of sort of coding the antigen. The antigen is the word for what's the marker for the foe. So it coats that and makes the rest of the immune system able to recognize that. And there's some 45 proteins involved in the complement system. And again, each one of these proteins had to be developed the right way and made the right way at the DNA level. And again, major regulation and lots of room for things going wrong. If some of these things aren't right, then that's been shown to be the source of a lot of different autoimmune disorders. Your immune system acts against some normal friend part of your body. And it's also, you may have heard something about checkpoint inhibitors. It's an important anti-cancer agent. They've developed these in just the last 15 years or so to identify how to potentiate or make your own immune system recognize tumor cells to kill them. So, reproduction, again, we've touched on this a little bit when we went through embryology and things, but just lots of complex specialized organisms. Remember, we went through the chromosomes and the DNA and mitosis and meiosis. I won't bore you there. The formation of the germ cells comes from very special organs under very special conditions. There's all kinds of things that have to be just right for actual fertilization to occur, for implantation of the fertilized egg to occur. And that's a large reason why there's infertility, if something here isn't right. So if this wasn't right from the start, you wouldn't have any babies. So one generation, it'd be a one and done. We wouldn't be here. Again, the embryogenesis is what really blows my mind, is that it knows how to fold and twist and form from, a one cell or two cell organism into a baby under enormously complex hormonal control. The birth process, there's all kinds of things that happen to the mother. The pubic bone there's a little piece of tissue between the two bones that actually becomes stretchy so that the baby can come out. The placenta has to separate at just the right time. If it goes too early, the baby dies, the mother might bleed out. And it had to work from the first mutation. Any one mutation at this stage would have been the end of the species. We wouldn't, of life, we wouldn't have been able to be here. So from the mom's perspective, there's amazing numbers of designs and features of pregnancy. There's fetal hemoglobin. It's the placenta, the mother's blood, that feeds nourishes the baby. But the baby's developing this so-called fetal hemoglobin, which prevents the CO2 from accumulating because the baby's not blowing it off in the lungs, right? The placenta, we said, there's a theory actually that the placenta is the egg layer that was lost from some gene. That's pretty weak. It's based on saying there's a 62% homology of some gene in chickens. More than likely, what they're talking about here is just a regulatory gene, is what some say. There's nutritional changes. That's why pickles and ice cream, might come at midnight. Some pregnancy, I don't know. My wife never had that, but anyway, cardiac output. Women who are pregnant are just they're pumping for two, so they're hot. They're taking off their sweaters when everyone else is freezing. Postnatal, you have to make just the right amount of milk with the right components that then changes actually in the first several days. And it had to work from the start. If it didn't work from the start, again, we wouldn't be here. Now, birth is a really amazing thing. If we want to look at birth from the baby's perspective, there's cataclysmic changes. It's not just for dad watching what's happening. The baby's going through just unbelievable changes. In utero, the umbilical cord provides blood, bypasses the lungs, and it bypasses the liver and kidneys, and through the placenta. But within seconds of birth, the hole in the heart closes off. So the pressure on the left side of the heart, which is what pumps our arterial blood, all of a sudden gets higher, so it starts pumping through our blood vessels, through the baby's blood vessels, where with oxygenated blood coming from the lungs, which then inflate. The portal vein, which goes through the liver, that opens up like that and starts working pretty much immediately. Maybe not immediately. Some kids have that yellow look to them, and that's the bilirubin. They have, but within days, that's better. The kidneys start to work. They can get the right mix of things as we talked about, and all kinds of other homeostatic systems. Not the least of which is glucose, but they keep track of sodium and potassium. All those systems have to start working immediately. And then we start the transition from that fetal hemoglobin to regular hemoglobin that takes about 6 months. The clotting factors start to form. And actually, the clotting factors form a peak at 8 days, you may know. And isn't it interesting that, Genesis talks about having circumcision on the 8th day. So when the clotting factors are maximal, not earlier, anyway. So all of this had to work the first time. And I've seen it a few times, although not every time. When my children were born, it's like, wow. It seems so possible for things to go wrong, because it could, with all these things happening at once. That if this didn't work from the start, I'm sounding like a broken record. We wouldn't be here. So just to summarize the human body, there's thousands, if not more, of systems. Many different features, different tissues that are specialized for different functions, different organs that are vital to life. They must have worked from the start. there's so many moving parts, they had to be working together from the start, that so-called irreducible complexity. And these have only had a few million years to occur. Again, the deep time argument is where evolution will bury this. So it certainly challenges my imagination to think that by chance all of these miracles could have occurred. And it challenges evolutionists' thoughts as well, which is why, and we'll talk next week more about the different theories and the history, really, of the evolution-creationist debate. So that's why they had to go to this neo-Darwinism, thinking that there's these all of a sudden leap forwards that occur. But there's just too many leap forwards to have been necessary. But we're not done yet, so we're gonna hone in on my favorite organ, which is the eyes. And this is just one organ. Probably we could have an ENT specialist talk about the nose for an hour. We could have the orthopedic surgeon talk about that. And so I'm just going to hone in on the one I know a little bit about and review just some of the complexities and question, again, the possibility of how could step by step this have happened, even if we want to enlarge the evolution thought to this punctuated equilibrium, these leaps forward. It just cries out design. You know, I think you'll agree with me. The hearing eye, the seeing eye, the Lord, hearing ear, the seeing eye, the Lord hath made even both of them. So this is a fairly famous Darwinian quotation as it pertains to the eye. He was talking about really just the refractive or focusing parts of the eye. And he says, so suppose that the eye, with all its inimitable contrivances for adjusting the focus to different amounts of light, for the correction of spherical and chromatic aberration, that's just imperfection in how the lens system is, how that could have been formed by natural selection seems, I freely confess, absurd in the highest degree. So this is Darwin. Now, keep that thought in mind. And he even said, in a letter to one of his confidant friends, the thought of it gives me a cold shudder. Keep this in mind. I'm going to come back to what it went on to say in just a moment. And again, he was just thinking about the optics of the eye. Now, you know, the eye, most of us only think of the eye, at least for the first most of our life, 50 years or more, as this glasses, right? We don't have exactly the right focus. So this is simple. This is just getting a pair of glasses, a contact lens, refractive surgery, something like that to refocus in the back of the eye. So, I mean, I don't want to totally denigrate it, but like this is nothing compared to what the rest of the eye is. In a general way, the front of the eye, the lens system is like the eye can be compared to a camera. So the front of the eye is like the lens system, and the back of the eye is the camera film, when cameras used to have film in them, namely the retina. So we're going to drill down on that. But the retina, which I'm depicting here, this is what it looks like if you're looking into an eye, a little cartoon from it. The very central part is what we always instinctively fixate our eyes on because that's where the best vision is, the fovea. But it's way more than that. And it's got these 10 different layers of cells that are all many of them interconnected, processing shapes and colors and movements in that nature. And not to mention that the way the eye formed in utero is a very orderly, specific way. I touched on earlier that there's these different germ layers, some parts of the way the developing fetus folds on itself is very orderly with how the lens, for example, comes from tissue outside the eye, but it gets engulfed inside the eye anyway. So, but again, even the retina is just the beginning of the many interdependent systems that constitute our vision. And again, most of these things, we don't even think about them unless we have a problem with them, right? So again, the light comes on into the eye, it activates a signal at the retina, and then that signal goes to the optic nerve, it gets processed through the lateral genicular bodies, it goes through the thalamus, which a lot of stuff, all neurosensory stuff goes to the thalamus. It's kind of like the gatekeeper of information to the brain, so it can process it and put it in the right format for the brain to understand in a general hand waving. And then those optic radiations go back to the back of the eye. The occipital cortex is where the part of the brain that serves directly vision. And what I didn't mention is that half of the fibers from each eye cross. That's called the chiasm. They decussate, so that everything that we see with the right side of our vision, the left side of each eye, goes to the back of our left brain, and everything from that we see to the left side goes to the right side of our brain. Why would that be? I don't know. The intraocular pressure has to be controlled right. If it's not, that's glaucoma, and that's a sight-stealing thing. The eyelids, they have to blink right. Supposedly it's the fastest of all of our muscles, but either way. We have to have the lacrimal glands. We don't make enough tears. The cornea gets dried out. The cornea starts to melt, perforates, again, blindness. The iris has to move just the right way, or it doesn't have to. You can live without an iris, but it's what helps you to have a better focus for the eye. We've got color vision pigments that we'll talk about in a little bit. And I talked about the radiations and this decussation of the chiasm. And just like I mentioned with some of the other sensory organs, especially the ear, there's multiple processing centers that depend on higher function. You know, we look at something and we can see that, okay, we can say what the pixel readings are, but we say that's a chair, or there's movement, or it's blue. There's all these higher order things that we do, and we'll say we can somehow recognize danger. If something's coming at us, we can instantaneously, it seems, figure out that that's a threat to us, so we better move out of the way, right? I mean, these things you don't really think about that we do every single day that require incredible interdigitation with the higher functions. Or we're dreaming even sometimes, and we can see things when we're dreaming, we think, you know. So just all these complex functions. And so many of them, again, we just take for granted. And I can't go into any more detail on that. But I'm not wanting you to understand how rhodopsin works, but I want you to understand that there's a process. This is just the rods, which is the black, the light or dark. There's similar mechanisms for colors, so we have 3 different colors. But there's a cycle of one particular molecule that will change its shape in response to a stimulus of light, making that changed shape institute that electrical impulse that goes back to your brain, and then recycle. So there's a lot of visual signaling that's got to be regenerative. If it's too much, then we're literally can be blinded by the light. Paul was blinded. We don't really know why. I don't have an explanation, or is anybody, for why the scale was dropped. I don't know what that is. But you'd think, wouldn't you, that if you get a flashlight at you, you know, you're temporarily blinded. But if you always had one thing looking at you, you'd burn out your photoreceptors. So God gave us a screensaver, okay? There's actually a little imperceptible to your naked eye jittering that takes place in our eyes, so that it moves the focus of things just ever so often, so it gives those cells that cycle a chance to regenerate and be able to be ready for the next stimulus. And this was first discovered in the 50s, and even more recent technology has verified it. And says that if you don't have it, then it's a big blur. Your vision is much worse. So vision isn't just a camera. It's a very active and important dynamic structure. Now, at the risk of getting a little too personal about things here, I'm going to tell you a process because I think it illustrates a lot of things. At the 150th anniversary of the publishing of The Origin of Species, this person here, who as near as I can tell is a retired, at the time, which would have been therefore 2009, right? Retired ophthalmologist. And he wrote a nice special article in the biggest, probably the most famous journal that we have in our field of ophthalmology. And he pointed out a lot of different things that he interpreted as evidence for, or potential evidence for evolution, taking it as a fact, which we'll see. And rhodopsin, which is what I just showed you, is that's the molecule that goes through that cycle to respond to the light and dark. It's a family of some 300 molecules, he pointed out, and in low forms, this gene controls it. But it's really been very well preserved for hundreds of millions of years. So I don't know how you can use this as an example of evolution when it really hasn't changed in these lower forms of activities. He comments on this panoply, this large number of different variations of eyes. He says that's evidence of Darwin's hypothesized intermediate forms. But we'd agree, and I'll show you some examples. There's a lot of variation in the eye, but none of them represent intermediate forms. And in fact, I'm going to show you some examples. You say, how could it possibly logically ever be an intermediate form? Compound eyes, which is what bees and flies and some certain insects have, they existed in the trilobites some 500 million years ago at that, remember that Precambrian explosion that all of a sudden everything started happening? But again, not too much has changed among crustaceans. If we look at those kinds of animals, insects, I guess they are called animals, insects are animals, it's the same now as the 500 million year old fossils would say. The one that I'm going to dwell on a couple of slides from here is this, what's called the Nielsen-Pelger model. And these two Norwegian, I think they were, investigators, hypothesized that if you made 2,001% steps from the optic pit to an eye, it could occur in 1 million years. Okay, well, they make these nice little drawings, And there's a lot of homology in how this might get here, but it doesn't match the function. It's kind of like Lamarck. Remember, I told you about that guy. He said, oh, just because a blacksmith, they get bigger muscles and they're going to pass those bigger muscles on to their children. Well, no, what you've been able to adapt to in one generation only gets passed to the other generation if it's written into your DNA code. And they seem to totally ignore this. So they don't talk anything about how any of these things are connected, all the connections I just mentioned, to the other parts of your brain and your body. It doesn't say anything about how that could be explained on a DNA, genetic basis. And he actually was repeating something I'll tell you from another author, that the eye has probably evolved about 40 or 60 times. I would say if it evolved one time, that would be unbelievable, much less that it could possibly have evolved in 40 or 50 different ways. So remember I told you, remember that quote? He pointed out that Darwin's quote that I quoted for you is often misquoted. Okay, and this kind of demonstrates the misquote he says, but he says just the refractive components were observed. He says, but he goes on to say, and Darwin does, that with each step, million by million, and preserved, altered on millions of individuals for millions of years, natural selection will pick out the right choice with unerring skill. Okay, so that's just kind of telling you where they're coming from. So that stimulated me to write a letter to editor to them. In the common, congenial spirit of scientific discourse and debate, and I pointed out that, natural selection, as we've said here, and microevolution is not the same as true macroevolution. The 2,000 steps, assuming that there's only two possibilities at each of those steps, is just not conceivable mathematically, given any kind of reasonable time frame. And I offered the math that I'll share with you in just a moment. I said, and I pointed out, as I just mentioned to you, the eye is not just an isolated anatomic unit. It's interacting with multiple other complex systems. And the fact that the assertion that the eye could, form many times independently just taxes logic. And I'd say as well, with all the variation in other species, why do some have better eyes in some regards than we do? That wouldn't make any sense. His response to my letter, that's the usual thing, you write a letter, then there's an opportunity to have open discourse. He said, sophisticated scientists, which wasn't me, know better, and the theory of evolution is not appropriate to argue. It's not been disproved in 150 years. So, okay, is this a courtroom? We just have to prove that we're not guilty? Or, anyway. And he says that the DNA evidence is misapplied. But he didn't offer exact reasons why. And that he cited mutations of antibiotic resistance. We've talked about that a couple of talks ago. That most of the time, they've been able to demonstrate that antibiotic resistance is an uncovering of something that was already there, not an evolution or gain of function, to quote a famous phrase now. And he buries his eye evolution in these millions of generations thing. And he told me, well, you should go read Darwin's Climbing Mount Improbable book, citing space limitations that he couldn't talk about. Well, I had already read that book, but there's at least some hope, though. I must have gotten about 20 emails off chart, to me directly. And it was about 10 to 1 in my favor. I was being congratulated for speaking out on this. So there's hope out there. Everybody out there isn't a hopelessly lost. So Climbing Mount Improbable was a book written by Richard Dawkins. I think I might have mentioned him earlier, but I'll go into him more next time. He's now, I think, emeritus professor of evolution, or I don't think he's got like a chemistry, biochemistry. I think it's like evolution professor at Oxford. And he's written this book, and I got it right here. So I did read it. I bought it and read it, okay? And I think it's important that we should read what others say, right? I mean, we have CIA. We want to know what everyone else is thinking, so we can just go to the bookstore and get it, or Amazon now, right? Anyway, so if you read through it, it's replete with all these pie-in-the-sky claims, a lot of arm-waving things based on computer modeling programs, which, I only sometimes trust these computers. I've got enough gray hair that that's my philosophy, some of the other people. But, if you can model it with a computer, that doesn't necessarily make it a fact. It could be very important. It could be very good. I'm not dissing the whole computer industry and value of it. And he cites these amazing spider web designs and seashells. And he's making some wonderful points of design, not of that. And he characterizes the cell as a specialized bacteria. And he says, and this is kind of when he was beginning to change this theory, He acknowledges the mathematical impossibility of protein construction, for example, as we did in the second lecture, I think it was, but stresses the concept that these random mutations can make these big jumps forward, what's called neocatastrophism. Oops, did I go backwards? And on chapter 5 of that book is where he says that this 40-fold path to enlightenment, this is where he asserts that the eye could have evolved independently 40 different times. And that's what Fishman was taken from. Now, these are smart people, so I don't by any means want to tell you that they're dumb. I mean, they just looked at facts with a different matter. So the specifics are glossed over, and it's like the same facts but different conclusions is the best way I have of describing it, you know. So just a little bit of math. I don't want to put you to sleep. I went through some of this stuff before. If we said that there were 2,000 steps, that means to get to the end, it's a 1 and 2 times 2,000 times, which is 10 to the 602nd. And remember that we talked about if we had the fastest, every particle in the universe vibrating or having a reaction, and the fastest reaction we know for the 25 billion or so years, that leaves there's still only a 1 in 10 to the 500th chance that this could have occurred. And again, that's just the morphology of the eye in this molecule. And I offered this information to him. And recall for perspective, just these numbers with these exponents may not really hit home because they're just phenomenally high numbers. There's only been 10 to the 65th photons produced by the sun in the entire 25 or 5 billion years or so that we might believe the sun has been there. So, I mean, look at that. And remember, just putting together 100 components from existing parts is 10 to the 159th. So that's the organic molecule is defined with 1,000 nucleotides. Speckner was 10 to the 600th. Huxley felt that, well, there's 10 to the 6 mutations to a horse, so that's about 10 to the 300,000th chance for a horse. Well, again, they bury that in millions and billions of years. And this is the biggest number. Speckner, remember I mentioned he's the biochemist, this Israeli. He calculated out that when you really put 60,000 proteins on an average of a small 100 amino acids encoded by the DNA codons, that would be 10 to the 27 millionth chance. Just to put that in perspective, I did a little calculation. And remember, it's about 1 in 300 million's chance that you'd win the Powerball or whatever it is. So you'd have to win the Powerball about every second of a 100-year life in order to have this number come up. So every single second of your life, and you live to 100 years, you'd win the Powerball. That's how, I think that's pretty convincing. There's actually a very interesting book, which I also got it when it came out, Evolution's Witness. And I had the opportunity actually to listen to him. He came and was a visiting professor at our school. He didn't like my questions, but anyway, he gave a really interesting systematic survey of some of the unique features of various eyes, which I'm going to share some of them with you here. But he organized it, of course, into an evolutionary old Earth framework, from the sea to the amphibian to the reptile to the bird, and mammals and such. But there's some telling statements he made that, of course, betray his philosophy, his bias. It says, eventually by chance hit upon a self-replicating molecule. I didn't say anything about going from DNA to proteins to life. And they acquired mitochondria, and the evolution discovered, evolution, I didn't know it could be in a verb form, but it had creativity, building this complex. There's these arm-waving things. He says there's 12 different kinds of eyes that evolved many times. The same theme that was being advanced by Dawkins. That the trochlea, which is part of a little thing in the eye, muscle goes through, but that it appeared. It just appeared. How did it get there? It just appeared. Again, he gives a lot of examples, and I'm going to, again, give you some of them that I would interpret not of evolution, but of design. So tracing the witnesses, this is some example. He points out how this oldest that we know is this cryobacteria, chlorophyll. It has a light sensor. It can, some plants can know whether it's light or dark, and they grow or not grow. An eye spot or a cornea began as the most primitive camera eye. The compound eye I talked about is all these little sort of tubes, if you will, of what's called ommatidia that sense light. And that's what you see, as I've said before, in like a fly or something. What's called a simple eye is what we have. There's nothing simple about it, but it's a single lens, for example, in a jellyfish. That dates back to about 500 million years ago. And then he talks about this providing a framework for bilaterality, which, by the way, I didn't mention that you have two eyes, you've got three-dimensionality, right? So imagine the processing that goes on with two eyes fitting into the brain and giving you the sense that this is in front of that, so I should grab here and not there. When you're driving your car or playing baseball or something like that, And each of these, though, is alive and thriving. It's not like these were all, as I keep saying, first drafts or rough drafts that got discarded. And he had the tendency to always equate taxonomic position with progression when there's no transitional forms of any kind. There's nothing that, and how could you go from this kind of an eye to our kind of an eye? I mean, it's like making a bicycle into, I don't know, a factory. It's two completely different things. So just let's go through some other things. Maybe some lower animals demonstrated some step-by-step development for us. Well, mollusks, they're pretty low in the totem pole. A scallop, it has actually each eye, it's got 40 or 50 eyes, and each eye has two separate retinas in it. This low-life little mollusk floating around down there. Conches, we've all seen conches. Their eyes are on these retractable stalks that can move independently, and they will regenerate if they're injured. Now that would be pretty cool to have, but you can have it if you go on Amazon. You can get, but. Now, an octopus, or as an example, really, of an invertebrate. Remember, an invertebrate means no backbone. They accommodate. We accommodate by changing our lens. When I say accommodate, well, most of us in this room can't accommodate much anymore. That's why we have reading glasses, right? But the young folk among us, you're able to change your lenses enough so you can focus in the distance and focus up near, without, I have to have my bifocal to see up close. But so we do that by changing the shape of our lens, which changes the focal point by making it more curved. Invertebrates do it, by some of them at least, by moving the lens front to back in the lens system. So how could you possibly go from this to this? Again, do you have one that partially changes shape and one that partially moves? And there's no examples really of that. The other thing that's really important, how could it happen in a invertebrate, a lower light? The light goes through the sensory part of the retina first, which then triggers some cascades and relays into the ganglion cells, which then communicate with the brain. But in the vertebrate, such as our eye, the light actually goes through our entire retina. Here's the direction of light here. It goes through our entire retina. It's coming this way, sorry. Anatomists like to turn the retina upside down. Clinicians like to turn the retina as if you're laying on your back, but that's another matter. So the light actually goes through the retina here, it strikes the photoreceptors, and then the signal comes back in the opposite direction that the incident light was. So if you've got, this is more than left-handed and right-handed. This is, up and down. How could that ever have changed? It doesn't make any sense. It's like totally binary. It's either up or it's down. You can't have something part way. And as it turns out, the squid, the octopus, also has a part of a brain right next to the eye, so it does a lot of on-site processing. And this low-life octopus, there's no octopus in here for me to, I didn't want to insult any octopuses if there, but they can detect polarized light, and we can't. And again, where are the transitional forms? Well, that's where they say, well, the eye developed 40 or 50 times. Or they'll use terms, they make up terms that sort of scare you off. Convergent evolution, The dragonfly is still pretty low. This is the one that's got an ommatidia. It's supposedly lost its eye. The wolf spider has 4 pairs of eyes. It's not actually an insect, it's a spider. Insects have 6 legs, spiders have 8. But it can detect polarization. The whirligig bug, it's got eyes above water and below the water, so it can see where it's going. And if they didn't have these things, they'd go extinct waiting for these protective mechanisms, right? Color vision across species. I might have touched on this. Humans have 3 different colors, red, green, and blue pigments. Males actually, about 8% are lacking one of those, and they're therefore colorblind. Women with a much lower risk, well under 1%, are colorblind. And certain old world, new world monkeys have a little bit of different, but an interesting point to me is that in the new world monkeys, the females have 3 colors and the males have 2. And I'm thinking that maybe that's the evolutionary explanation for why husbands are always needing to ask their wives where things are. But Most mammals, though, are dichromats. So gorillas and things only see 2 colors, except for the Arctic reindeer has 4 for whatever reason, can see UV. But birds, reptiles, and insects are tetra, and they have 4 different color things. So their sensitivities can vary, but why would we lose that? But there's more. Chickens, like all birds, have 4 colors. But chickens have these specialized receptors, a double cone that allows them to detect movement. And if any of you ever watched that Rocky II film where Rocky Balboa was told by his trainer to go catch this chicken, he couldn't do it at first, but maybe that's why the chicken can get away from us easier. So, of course, this is being explained by evolutionists saying, well, the reason birds have better color vision is because they didn't have to spend so much time in the dark during their evolution. Okay. All right. And then here, why were most mammals dichromats? Humans are trichromats, but the lower birds are tetrachromats. So again, you would think logically you'd go from less to more somehow or another. So why would we lose a color pigment? The mantis shrimp actually has 12 to 16 visual pigments. It's sensitive to infrared light and other things. It's got unilateral stereopsis. I had a nice movie here, but I don't think I'm going to have time to show it, so well, what the heck, we'll run over a little bit, okay? I'm trying to get that started if you guys can do it for me. There we go. This is kind of cool.
He closes in on his target.
Remember, he lives deep in the ocean, so it's dark down there. This is lights to show it. This is lunch.
The mantis shrimp unloads the ace up his sleeve. Hammer claws.
You can't even see it in slow motion.
These spring-loaded clubs strike 50 times faster than we can blink.
Anyway, because it's so dark is why they can see, so we can move on. Other vertebrates, they have an extra muscle, a retractor bulbar. In other words, they can pull their eye in if there's some danger or something going on. So it's a 7th muscle. We have 6 muscles that make our eyes move. Just like the last branch, these are rays. Just like the octopus, it can move, like other invertebrates, it can move the lens. But it's interestingly, this one has a multifocal retina. It's got one part of the retina for near and another part of the retina for far. It's kind of like our lenses or our bifocals might have that. Hammerhead shark, I told you about how half of our fibers cross or decussate. For some reason, sharks, everything from the right eye goes to the left brain, and everything from the left eye goes to the right brain, and not just half and half. So why would that be? Fisheye designs. Flying fishes, they climb out of the water, they go back in the water. Was this Nemo? Wasn't that Nemo that looks like that? They've got these little sunshades, these puffer ships. They've got this shade, this pigment on their cornea that gives them sort of sunshade from above. Here's another kind of sort of surface animal like a frog that's got different shapes or curvature of its cornea for above and below so that it can see both above and below at the same time. Evolutionists would say, well, these are just selection pressures, but it makes more sense to me, and I think you'd agree that this is design. Bird's eye view, one of the cells in the middle of those 10 layers of cells I said is the amacrine layer cell, and they integrate a lot of signals, but birds have 3 times more of those cells than mammals do, than we do. So why would we lose that? And diving birds, we've all seen the anhingas go flying around the Everglades or whatever. They can see above, then they can see the fish underneath. How do they see underwater? Well, we just put goggles on if we want to see underwater, but birds actually can change the shape by pushing their lens through their pupil to make it more curved at the front and see better underwater. Some other sort of unique things, these eye droplets in certain fish and reptiles allows them to reduce glare. Different index of refraction within the lens, not changing the shape of the lens, but part of the lens, it's kind of like those multifocal intraocular lenses if people have them, or our own little transitional glasses. In the cold water, the marlin and sailfish, the movements of their eye muscles actually generates enough heat to help them keep them warm in the colder water. The dragonfish has these night vision goggles that they can detect color in the deep dark, even though there's no light there. And I think this is kind of interesting. If you've ever, the flounder is actually born with one eye on each side, but shortly after birth, the one eye migrates to the other side, and the flounder is always laying on his side, usually laying on its side at the bottom of the sea. So, but it migrates. The giant squid, this is the biggest eye in the world. They've got 10-inch diameters. One eye that's very dissimilar, one eye for looking up, one eye for looking down. And this is a real complex eye, and again, a very low-level kind of animal. The eyes move. I'm going to just skip that because we're running out. You've all seen this. You've seen your dog in the dark. The dog has this thing called a tapetum, which is kind of like a photo multiplier that reflects the light so that the dog or the animal can see better in the dark than you can. Kind of like, again, night vision goggle type effect. There's a thing called the nictans, which is sometimes referred to as the third lid that some animals have that helps protect their cornea, especially if they're living in a hazardous environment. And they're saying that the nictans is so important, it evolved twice. But it's not homologous between amphibians and reptiles. It doesn't look or develop the same way. And then I think it was the Schwab book said that adnexa developed with land migration. Adnexa is what goes around the eye, like your eyelids, eye muscles, the tear glands, and things like that. Again, very, very complex things that you don't think about until you're having a problem with them. Reptiles actually lack any blood vessels in their retina. Humans have a central artery. Birds have this other sort of avascular retina, but that would constitute losing, going from having retinal vascular. Well, I guess let me just skip on that one. The pit viper here doesn't need any vision because it's usually evidently digging in the ground, but they've replaced their eye position with these thermal sensors. But later, it said that snakes reinvented the eye and converted these things. But again, they're two completely different functions, and how they could think that doesn't make any sense. You might ask, how come woodpeckers don't get concussions or ruin their eye? If you get punched in the eye, you can get retinal detachments and hurt your eye. Well, their bones are first a very tight orbit, and there's all kinds of muscles, even within the retina, within the eye, that makes it so that it cushions in an exact time frame the impact. And the nerve in the back doesn't wiggle. It's also very tight, so it wouldn't be damaged by trauma like that. And as I say, that's the same mechanism for protecting them against having concussions. So, now this is one I'm going to run over just a little bit to tell you because I think this one's really cool. You talk about eagle eye, right? Why? Because an eagle can see like 4 times as well as we can. For 2020, this is 25. It can see. It's got like 1 million photoreceptors per millimeter, whereas we have only 200,000 per millimeter. I showed you the picture earlier. Can you get a sense that this is even more compact than the human? I've reproduced it here. It's even more compact. And notice that there's no blood vessels here. So this is the raptor has it. So it saves the space by not having blood vessels there. And but it's got. It also gets some benefit because it's got such a tight dip here. It gets some magnification. But more remarkably is they have 2 foveas. The fovea is the part you're used to read with. It can see to the side just as well as it can see the center at one point. And that helps them be able to catch prey because they can fly, catch the prey, and then turn on them. And I just think this is a really cool, this is only about 30 seconds, I think. So can you start that one for me? There we go.
A peregrine falcon in a stew is the fastest animal in the world.
Eagle and
Germany has measured
they're
its
raptors
speed
in
at
the same category.
217 miles per hour.
Notice how it makes a little turn at the end here. It's chasing this other bird, and then it makes a little turn. So it's able to see its prey.
A peregrine.
Oh, there we go. So you'd say, why would we not have good vision too? So I'm just tongue-in-cheek here, a summary of our eye deficiency. What have we lost? We've lost the ability to pull our eye in, like those, what were they, mollusks had. We've lost that extra eyelid protector. We've lost several photo pigments, and we don't have all these other protective bones against being hit. We don't have the oil droplets to see in the dark or to see polarization. We never got a double lens or a multifocal lens or multifocal cornea, multifocal retina for presbyopia protection. We didn't get any extra eyes, and somehow we got our retina upside down. So, like, what a mess! How did we get here? Did evolution go backwards? I don't think so. So I've handled out the eye as an example here. It's improbable, and I showed you a number for that. There's a lot of contradictory things that completely tax logic, like the upside-down retina, and showed you that just the eye is so much more complex than that stupid little simple model. I shouldn't say stupid. They're not stupid people, but the model is overly naive. And it's so many features of the eye, much less the rest of the body, are irreducibly complex. And I'd posit the question, which theory explains these facts the best? And again, I think the eyes cry out design. So this is our last real science-rich talk. We have another one that'll be more theologically based. We've gone from the smallest to the biggest, remember all that stuff, cosmology and the human organs we went through. And just the eye, we went into a little bit of a deeper thing. And I'm going to contend you that I didn't just give you a mountain of evidence, I gave you a mountain range of evidence. But the most important and most convincing evidence is still yet to come in 2 weeks when we go over the scriptural basis for creationism. Thank you for your attention. Okay, I was waiting for a heckler. By analogy with a computer, but
Right. And memory is a product of the neurons on and off over a period of time to create that imprint in your mind. The eye,
figuratively speaking.
the eye now as a channel to the brain functions, from what I understand, the same way with neurons, on and off.
As do all neurons, yeah.
Can
The brain, the eye is a neuron, a bunch of neurons.
isn't a stimulation to the eyesight a path to retarding senility? I know that's a difficult.
It's an interesting hypothesis, but I'm not up on the latest thinking of that. But I mean, our muscles hypertrophy, you got to move them. And it makes sense that you have to keep those networks fertile, but I don't know how much.
Channel to the
I mean, they'll talk about, if you do a crossword puzzle or if you do whatever it is, you'll delay senility. But I always look at those things with a little bit of rolling eyes, because there's a whole industry that's preying upon people who want to live longer and do better. And some of them might be true, but I don't think we have anything that's got us proven there. There was, of course, a big drug that failed its clinical trials on Alzheimer's specifically, which is maybe a more advanced form of just simply, what you're describing. And then there's something then that came out recently that they said it did delay it. So I don't know, but you're going to have to fork out probably at least 5 figures to get those medications. So they're real expensive when they get something like that. So that's why people like to buy pharma stocks.
And just for next go round, had a talk on this once and presented the human body, the eye, and the hand as being so complex. The brain, the eye, the hand as being so complex. There aren't two identical from the beginning of time till now. I think that was a given. And somebody said to me afterwards, see this stone? Since the beginning of time, there are two alike, identical. Now, I didn't have an answer for it, but
Well, there's no two snowflakes, supposedly, so it serves the reason that a lot of other things would be unique. I mean, they say there's no two snowflakes that are exactly the same, because we're talking about molecular level, there can be so much variation.
so we're extinguishing probability. And we can't do that. someone said, it's probable.
It's probable that what? I'm losing you there. Maybe possible.
Possible.
Well, yeah, but it's also possible that you'll hit the lottery, you know, every second for a 100-year life. So
That seems to me the heart of.
it sounds like, wasn't that Lot? You know, wasn't that Lot? If it's only 5, if there's only 20, will you preserve it? If there's only 4, he's like, yeah, it's fine. But anyway, will you preserve Sodom and Gomorrah? You know, isn't there? There's a movie, and I can picture it being said, but who's that? Jim Carrey says something about he was trying to get a date from somebody, and he says, is there a chance I can? No chance. Well, is there a 1 chance in 10? No. Is there 1 chance in a million you'll go out with me? She says, yes. He goes, oh yes, there's a chance. So I mean, okay, and that's what evolution hangs on. Somewhat, but even evolutionists aren't believing that, because that's why they're saying this punctuated equilibrium, as if there's this big step forward that happens, you know, from time to time. But I mean, the numbers are just, how could it be? And if I told you, NASA says that 10 to the 50th, 10 to the 1 over 10 to the 50th, 10 to the minus 50th is the same mathematically as 0, you know, then that's probably 0. 10 to the 2 millionth or 24 millionth is pretty low. Anyway, anybody else? Questions? I don't want to hold anybody if you want to leave. Yes, sir. Is eye cancer a thing? Yeah, melanoma is the most common. It comes from the layer of cells under the retina, the retinal pigment epithelium. But it can also be skin metastasis to the eye. There's plenty of things that can metastasize the eye. Not a common, but a well-known childhood tumor, retinoblastoma, you may know about, people can get. Babies will show up with. So, but there's lots of other lymphomas can form in the eye, you know. Ooh, that's a good number. Common enough that there's a pretty busy subspecialty on eye oncology. You know, I can't give you a number. I know that nevi will transition with something in the 1 in 10,000 if you have a nevus, and about 1 in 10 people have that. So it's probably somewhere in the 1 in a million range. 1 in a million to 1 in 100,000. So, yes, ma'am. Well, I'm not here to necessarily offer professional advice tonight, but I can tell you that the cataract surgery is the singularly most successful surgery known to mankind. Some 2.5 million of them are done every year. Not all of them are necessary when they're done, I might quickly add, but you know, if it's the lesser of the two evils, it's all a matter of when is it bad enough. People get their hips replaced when they can't walk. So you get your cataract replaced if that's the reason you can't see. So we'd rather have what God gave us, but if on the other hand, because of Adam's sin, it's breaking down, and if the lesser of two evils is something with as high a good track record, then most people would decide to do that. But on the other hand, if you can live without it, you don't have to do it. You don't die because of it, you know.
Do you think you could go blind if you don't get the cataract?
Well, there's blind and there's irreversibly blind, right? There's really hungry or there's starving, you know. So, I mean, you can lose vision eventually, sure. I mean, you do. That's the definition of a cataract. So it's when your own lens is cloudy. You know. All right. Well, again, I don't want to hold everybody. I kept you 6 minutes longer than so thank you.